All right, so hey everybody, my name is Jonathan. I'm a solutions architect based in Atlanta. I was actually born in Huntsville and I went to Ole Miss, so don't hold that against me. So today I'm going to talk to you about CloudTrail and CloudWatch. Those are two sort of foundational behind the scenes services within AWS, and look at how you can do some monitoring within those two services. So CloudTrail records, and I have some slides just to go over this, and then we need to figure out how I'm going to show some demos. So that may be a problem right now based on my laptop situation, but let me see how we can get around that. So CloudTrail records AWS activity, and then CloudWatch is a monitoring service. So the goal here is to show how you can use CloudWatch and CloudWatch dashboards to view and look at CloudTrail. CloudTrail is it can be very verbose depending on what's going on in an AWS account. So it may be kind of just looking at it, it will be hard to see things of interest. So the goal today is to kind of show how you can do some analysis of what is going on in a particular AWS account. Cool, so let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is sort of the definition of CloudTrail that I took directly from the FAQ. So it's a web service that records activity in your account, and it delivers that activity by default to something called event history, which is kept for 90 days. Best practice is to extend that and deliver CloudTrail activities to a log file in an S3, and then optionally include CloudWatch. So the goal today is to show how CloudWatch, which is an optional setting, can show the how you can do some analysis of CloudTrail data. Let's move on to the next slide. So this slide talks about what is default when you first create an account, which is the left side, event history, and then what the advantages of actually enabling it a step further by turning on trail logging to S3. So a couple of points here. The event history, the default setting on the left is kept for 90 days. If you turn on the actual logging to S3 and optionally to CloudWatch logs, you can keep that data for longer. So we tend to recommend turning on actual trails, and to show and to do what I'm showing a little bit later on, you need to enable that. Again, those are sort of just standard best practices. And of course, throughout these few slides I have, and I don't know if it's common practice or not for your group, but I can make the slides available. So there's some links in there on most of the slides for more info. All right, cool. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. On the left side, an S3 bucket is created. That can be actioned through a number of different ways, CloudFormation or Terraform templates, through the SDK or CLI, or just through the regular web console. So when that resource is created, or a resource is created, CloudTrail logs that event. And so that's the AWS API things that I'm talking about that CloudTrail monitors. It's just for a point of comparison. Once that bucket is created, by default, if someone or something uploads an object into that S3 bucket, CloudTrail will not capture that event. But you can enable that if you want to. That's called a data plane event. So if you're if you're curious about or needing to log actual data plane events, objects, GET requests, PUT requests inside a bucket, for example, you can enable that as part of setting up CloudTrail, but by default, it's not. Again, the point of this talk is to say, once you have an AWS account that's fairly busy, maybe you have developer teams updating applications, maybe you have third-party services running in the account. A lot of times, or most of the time, you'll see those applications, whether they're third party or custom built, they're going to need permissions to do something in AWS. And so an example, of course, would be creating a bucket, might be reading a DynamoDB table. You know, any of the AWS services, typically it's going to be sort of denied by default unless you give permission to that application to do something with those resources. And the way to do that is with an IAM role. So what I want to show today is what are some of the top API calls in an account? How do you look at that? And so let's move on to the next slide. So how we can sort of examine, one way of examining CloudTrail data is to optionally turn on CloudWatch. And then from there, you can then do some queries. So what is CloudWatch? CloudWatch is the sort of an intrinsic service within AWS. It allows you to monitor, store, and access logs. Typically, in the context of CloudWatch, it's used for metrics like CPU metrics and network metrics and things like that. So that's the metric side of CloudWatch. There's another side of CloudWatch called CloudWatch logs. So, and that allows you to do the ingestion and analysis of log data. And that log data can be application logs, it can be other logs, but today's we're talking about CloudTrail logs. So enable CloudTrail, writing out to S3, and then turn on CloudWatch. And then you can set a retention policy on CloudWatch. So maybe you only want to look at or keep the last 5 days, 7 days, or whatever in CloudWatch, but a longer retention policy in S3, for example. Again, this is just sort of scratching the surface of what CloudWatch logs is. I encourage you to read the docs, the link below on most of all the other capabilities are documented there. And so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so again, sort of the point of this talk is CloudTrail plus CloudWatch logs is better. And the reason for that is it allows you to do some SQL-like querying of the CloudTrail data. You can develop some dashboards, and then you can also do some eventing, right? So CloudWatch as an eventing service, if a particular CloudTrail activity has been executed and you want to monitor that, then you more than just through a dashboard or something, you can tie that into SNS and receive, for example, an email notification of that specific event. Okay, so this is, I need to figure out how I'm going to show these demos. So before I work on that, any questions on CloudTrail or CloudWatch? And I know this has been really a high-level talk on these two services. My intent was to show some demos. Let me see how I can do that, but happy to entertain any questions if there are any. Okay, all right, so let's take a quick look at CloudTrail. And there may be a little bit of delay here. Doing some crazy magic here. All right, so like I said, event history is the default setting of CloudTrail. To do what I'm going to show, to show some analysis, et cetera, through CloudWatch, you need to go in and enable an actual trail. And I'll just show you my settings. This is my test AWS account that AWS provides. So I have a CloudTrail and I have it set to going to this log group. Okay, once that is set up, we're going to go into CloudWatch and see. Oh, let me just show some events in here just so you can get an idea if you haven't looked at it in a while. So like I said, there's some, it's kind of hard just to eyeball this and see something that's unusual. Obviously, there's a lot of this event. And just as I mentioned, this is a test account. There's really no real activity going on. But there are some things like Systems Manager, it's doing some stuff to simulate some activity. And I'll show you this. Actually, let me show you this now. I have two EC2 machines, one of which I've already peed into. and I've set up just a scheduled task on Windows and a Linux cron job on another EC2 machine, just to do exercise 2 API calls. And so what I'm simulating here is on this Linux machine, it's calling a get bucket API call every minute. And that's just to simulate some traffic in CloudTrail. And so as I kind of mentioned again, and I can do some more explaining if needed, there's an IAM role attached to this EC2 machine that has S3 read-only permissions. So this is an example of an EC2 machine has permission to call the S3 API and do a list buckets request. But it's doing that over and over to generate some traffic. And I'll explain that why that's useful in a minute. The second machine that I'm currently on now, this Windows machine, it has a more restricted IAM role attached to it. So it has an IAM role called app1_no_perms. It really can't do anything besides SSM. And so on this Windows machine, I have a scheduled task every minute. It's trying to do a get Lambda request through PowerShell. So but it does not have access to do that. So this is a case of where something is misconfigured, or it's trying to do something that it's not supposed to do. And so we have these 2 use cases. One where something is authorized, and another use case where something is not authorized. Now, the use case behind the first one, where it does have permissions to call the API, the reason why that can be important is, for example, in my last company, we had a particular development team that used DynamoDB. And I was going through CloudTrail and looking at the logs and stuff, and I was like, there's this DynamoDB create table statement that's being executed over and over again. Why is that? That was a case where the application IAM role had that actual permission to do that, but from an application level, it was not needed. That table already exists, and so that was an example where something was, even though it had the permissions, it really wasn't necessary, or probably, maybe adding a few extra milliseconds to the code because it was doing something that it didn't need to do. And then there's the other example of where something is making a request and it does not have those permissions. That's a more obvious use case of spotting something that's been misconfigured, or it's trying to do something that it doesn't need to do, right? And so the goal of today is to say, how do you look and see those types of events? So let's go into CloudWatch. So just to step back for a second, we have CloudTrail. It's delivering into CloudWatch logs. And we'll take a look at how to do some, how do I turn this thing off? Okay. So here's the log group that contains CloudTrail logs. And I can just kind of manually search through this. Again, this is really not a whole lot more different than looking at CloudTrail directly or looking in S3 bucket itself. The power comes in using log insights. So what we can do here is find the log group again. And now we can run some queries on this log group using something similar to SQL. And I've got some queries over here. There's some that are already, by default that have already been created, but I've created these. So let's just look at, for example, this will show CloudTrail log events, group it by the event name, but only for events where it's an active access denied type of a situation where something is trying to call an AWS API and it does not have permissions. So this is the example of the Windows machine, or it will show when I run this, the Windows machine is trying to do a GET request on Lambda, but it does not have those permissions. So let's run it and see what happens. And there we go. So you can see how this thing is executing quite often, 29 times in the past hour. And so you can do more queries on this. Let's take a look at this one. This is just all events, or not necessarily access denied or not, and just kind of get an idea of what's going on in the account. And so I don't know if you noticed this, but I've sorted by count descending. So it's the topmost, or it's ranked in descending order. And so this is an example of that list bucket. So this is the other machine that does have access to the API, but does it really need to do that, right? That's a situation where it's misconfiguration, but not an access denied or unauthorized error. So taking these two queries a little bit further, you can develop a dashboard, which I've done. And so you can add, you know, whatever type of widgets you want to this dashboard. I've got the two here. So the top, authorized AWS API calls by event name, and the top unauthorized API calls by event name. And so that's kind of a way of, you know, folks may not want to query the data directly, or may want to get into the syntax. There's a special syntax on, you know, on using CloudWatch Insights, but once you create some queries and add it to a dashboard, it may be easier to just kind of keep an eye on things. There is a blog post that goes into analyzing CloudTrail data with CloudWatch even more. So for example, I gave a use case earlier, you know, like for example, if you want to monitor IAM credentials being created, you know, IAM users or access keys. So that could be a widget on here, or you could tie that into SNS to be notified of that, those types of things. So I'll make sure you have it's in the PowerPoint, the link to that specific blog post. But that's kind of what I wanted to cover today. Any questions or comments on this? Anybody there? Can you all hear me?
Is anyone out there in the group actively using, you know, to what extent, anybody want to talk about the extent that you're utilizing CloudWatch today along these lines?
What you presented, I find really, really useful. In our firm, we use a lot of Lambda, and there's a lot of you know, logs here and there, trying to sift through, seeing what's wrong, but being able to aggregate it and actually query it. This is a game changer. Just thank you. This is awesome.
Cool. Yeah, like I mentioned sort of at the beginning before a lot of folks joined, this isn't super exciting stuff. CloudTrail, CloudWatch has been around for a while, but you may find it useful once, or your customers may find it useful if you work with other customers. You know, once your AWS accounts have a certain level of activity, kind of monitoring what's going on in terms of AWS API usage could be useful to the developer teams or third-party services, et cetera, right? So just kind of keeping an eye on things. Cool.
Last call. Any other questions or comments?
Hey, Jeremy, I can add that I've used CloudWatch logs for CloudFront, and there's a lot of good information that gets logged in these logs. And I've used them to see like where the accesses came from, which edge location, you know, they entered into the AWS internetwork, and able to plot those like on maps and things, those kind of locations. So it gives you an idea of like where the accesses are coming from for your, CloudFront fronted site. So yeah, there's a lot of good information in these logs.
Cool.
Yeah,
How much time do you have left in the meeting typically? Because I can show this host access thing, just how I got around this Zoom issue if you're interested in looking at that.
sure. We typically run till about up till close to 1 o'clock, close to the hour. So yeah, if you've got anything else you want to show, I'd love to see it.
Okay. Let me get back into here. May have stopped Zoom on this computer. Let me see if I can do this again. Hold on. Okay. Let me get rid of that. All right, cool. So it looks like AWS restricts Zoom on our laptops. But more importantly, there's a capability within EC2 and Systems Manager that allows you to connect into those devices without going through sort of a network port-based connection. So for example, Linux, it would be SSH on port 22. Windows would be RDP on 3389. And so that's a capability of Systems Manager. There's two requirements for this to work. One is the SSM agent has to be installed. If you launch an instance using an Amazon created image, AMI, from the last year or two, it already has that agent installed. But the second requirement is to have access to the service in the form of an IAM role. So if you look at this role here, there's a managed policy called Amazon SSM Managed Instance Core. So that allows the EC2 machine to connect to the SSM service, and it will then provide this connect button to work. So the way that works is click here and then hit connect. So now I have a browser to SSH terminal into this Linux machine. Once that comes up. Okay, so there you go. You can do whatever you want to do. And again, this does not require any sort of network access to this specific machine. On the Windows side, you have two options. The web-based option is to, it'll open up what's called a PowerShell command line. Which is very similar to, at least from a visual perspective, to Linux SSH. So again, this isn't relying on any sort of network connectivity to this particular machine. The other option, which I'm actually using now, is to run the AWS CLI on your local computer and create a tunnel into the SSM service. And then that allows RDP to access that particular machine. So that's actually what I've done now is I've RDP'd into this Windows machine, even though I don't have network access to this particular machine. And so that's been around for a little while. Systems Manager has a ton of capabilities. if you look in here and go down to on the left, it's called Session Manager. So that's the capability that allows access to machines. And if you turn on logging, it'll log what is going on.
I'm assuming that's like typical services that's controlled by your IAM profile and everything, whether you can access it or not.
Yes. So it's dependent on the target machine that you want to connect to. It needs to have that SSM role that I mentioned earlier, the what is it called? Core instance or managed instance core. That allows the SSM agent on the machine to connect to the SSM service. So that's required, at least for on-prem devices. Systems Manager will work, on EC2 machines, not on-prem. But Systems Manager does work. You can install the agent outside of AWS and still have this Session Manager connectivity function. So that's can be useful. Obviously, it could mean you or your customers don't need jump boxes or bastions, all that stuff, right? And then figure out, the networking access for those. All right, cool. Any other questions on what I've presented today?
Thank you. That was super informative.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I hope it was.